Picture this. You're watching one of those really high-budget Netflix true crime documentaries, right?
Oh, yeah, the ones with the slow panning shots and the moody synth music playing in the background.
Exactly. So the camera is slowly panning down this dark, narrow hallway. A door clicks open and you step inside. And here's the twist. Instead of a chalk outline on a hardwood floor or, a smoky room with overturned chairs, you walk into a glowing, humming corporate server room.
Right, which to most people just looks like an IT closet.
Yeah. To a normal person walking off the street, it's nothing but blinking blue and green lights, rows of metal racks, and that constant freezing blast of cooling fans. But to a digital forensics investigator,
It's a completely different world.
it's a bloody, chaotic crime scene. I mean, it is absolutely covered in hidden fingerprints, invisible tripwires, and ticking legal time bombs just waiting to detonate.
It really is, because
Yeah.
the reality of modern crime is that the smoking gun, it's rarely made of steel anymore. It's made of silicon. It's a string of compiled code or like a proxy server log.
Right.
And treating that humming, sterile room with the exact same gravity, caution, and honestly legal paranoia as a physical murder scene. Well, that's the entire foundation of digital forensics.
Which is wild to think about. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. If you are a student at Tarleton State University's Dr. Sampak College of Business, whether you're studying MIS, CIS, IT, or honestly just general business, you really need to listen closely today.
Absolutely. The concepts we are unpacking today are going to directly impact your professional future.
Yeah, but before we step under that yellow police tape, I want to invite you to like, subscribe, and share this deep dive. Engaging with this content early on ensures you don't miss the insider tips that will, position you for a really brilliant career in the tech and business landscapes. Also, be sure to check the description below for some excellent additional resources to help you continuously learn.
It's such an essential skill set. You don't have to be a law enforcement officer to encounter these scenarios.
Right, like a regular business student could run into this.
Oh, 100%. As a future IT manager, a C-suite executive, or maybe a systems auditor, you will inevitably face a moment where digital data suddenly transforms into critical legal evidence.
Which perfectly sets up our mission today. So last week we covered Chapter 4, dealing with the intricate details of data acquisition, essentially the technical methods for, just grabbing the data.
Right, the extraction part.
Yeah. But today we are moving into Chapter 5, processing crime and incident scenes. And we are drawing these insights directly from the 2025 edition of The Guide to Computer Forensics and Investigations by Nelson, Stewart, Phillips, and Wilson.
A fantastic resource.
It really is. This is the 5th of 15 chapters we are covering, and it takes us out of the theoretical space and right into the physical world. We are going to explore the meticulous procedures, the strict legal boundaries, and that crazy technical tightrope investigators walk to ensure digital evidence actually holds up in front of a judge and jury.
Yeah, we're basically tracing the life cycle of the data today, from defining what evidence actually is in the eyes of the law to navigating the complex legal authorization required to look for it.
The paperwork, basically.
Exactly, the heavy legal paperwork. Plus the intense physical preparation of specialized gear, the chaotic reality of breaching a live scene, and ultimately protecting that fragile data in a controlled laboratory environment.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the very beginning with a concept that, honestly, it fundamentally rewired how I view computer systems. Like, what actually counts as digital evidence?
Right, what's the baseline definition?
Yeah. At a baseline, we define it as anything stored or transmitted in digital form. But the legal classification is where it gets incredibly strange to me. U.S. courts accept digital evidence as physical evidence.
They do.
And I have to admit, that sounds entirely counterintuitive. I mean, it's just electrons, right? It's invisible data on a magnetic platter or a flash chip. How can the law treat a text message with the exact same physical reference as, like, a blood-stained knife?
Well, it requires a major shift in how we understand physics and the law. Legally speaking, the courts have determined that data is not just an abstract concept floating in the ether.
Okay, so what is it then?
Think about it physically. When you save a file to a traditional hard disk drive, the read-write head of that drive generates a magnetic field. It physically alters the polarity of microscopic magnetic domains on the platter.
So you're actually changing the physical makeup of the drive.
Exactly. A 1 is a magnetic region pointing in one direction. A 0 is a region pointing in the opposite direction. You have physically rearranged the atomic structure of that disk to represent information.
Wow. So because there is a measurable physical alteration to the medium, it graduates from being an abstract idea to a tangible object.
That is the exact legal justification. And because it is physical evidence, it carries immense weight. An IP address log or a deleted spreadsheet holds the exact same legal gravity as a forged paper contract or a physical weapon found at a crime scene.
That is heavy.
It is. But treating it as physical evidence brings us to a massive legal complication that every business student really needs to understand, which is the hearsay divide.
Right, the hearsay rule. Okay, to set the baseline for everyone listening, hearsay is essentially secondhand information presented in court. It's when a witness takes a stand and says, well, John told me he saw the defendant steal the car, rather than John taking the stand himself.
Because you can't question the original source.
Right. The U.S. legal system generally hates hearsay, largely because of the Sixth Amendment's Confrontation Clause. You have the constitutional right to cross-examine your accuser and test their credibility. And obviously, you can't cross-examine a rumor, but how does this apply to computers?
It forces us to divide all digital records into two deeply distinct categories: computer-generated records and computer-stored records.
Okay, let's look at the first one. What's a computer-generated record?
So a computer-generated record is data created purely by an automated process within the system itself, completely devoid of human intervention.
Like what?
Think of an automated firewall log, a proxy server log, or a background process that records the exact millisecond a user logged into a network.
So the system is just mechanically documenting its own reality.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Because it's a mechanical process, the courts consider these real computer evidence. And the critical factor here is that they are generally exempt from the hearsay rule.
Wait, why? Why doesn't hearsay apply?
Because a machine does not have a motive to lie. A firewall does not hold a grudge against an employee. It doesn't, misremember what happened because it was tired. It simply executes its programming. Therefore, you don't need to put the firewall on the witness stand to cross-examine its character.
That makes a ton of sense. But then they have the second category, computer-stored records. These are the electronic spreadsheets, the Word documents, the emails, the Slack messages, right?
Yes, files created by human beings. Because a human typed those words, consciously decided to input those specific numbers into a financial ledger, or crafted that text message, the computer is merely acting as a digital envelope holding a human statement.
So the computer is just the messenger.
Exactly. Therefore, it is considered hearsay computer evidence.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Let's try to apply this to a real-world business scenario for the students listening. Imagine we are investigating a massive corporate embezzlement case.
Okay, classic white-collar scenario.
Right. The CFO is suspected of siphoning millions into an offshore shell company. Now, the automated server log that proves an email was transmitted from the CFO's account to an offshore bank at 3:00 a.m. That log is the computer-generated record.
Right.
It is an objective mathematical fact. But the contents of that email, where the CFO writes to the bank, this money is definitely for legitimate consulting fees, that is human-generated. It might be a complete calculated lie.
That illustrates the divide perfectly. The log proves the transmission event happened. It is admissible fact. The content of the email is a human statement wrapped in digital packaging, and it must overcome complex legal hurdles to be admitted as evidence of truth.
So if you're working on the IT side of this investigation, what's your role in that?
If you are an IT auditor or a forensics investigator, navigating this divide is a daily minefield. You must constantly prove that the system generating the automated logs is highly reliable and hasn't been tampered with, while simultaneously working with legal teams to find exceptions that allow the human-generated files to be admitted.
Man, this sounds like a logistical nightmare. If the entire admissibility of a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud case rests on whether an IT guy collected a server log correctly, who sets the rules? How do investigators know the specific protocols that will appease a judge?
They rely on two foundational organizations, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and SWGDE, the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence.
And who are they?
Well, NIST is a highly respected agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and they essentially run the world's most rigorous testing facility for technology. SWGE is a collaborative body of the top experts across federal, state, and private forensics laboratories.
So they aren't just making casual suggestions. They are writing the absolute, universally accepted recipe book for handling digital evidence.
They establish methodologies that are practically bulletproof. They publish peer-reviewed standards for everything from, like, how to physically disconnect a hard drive to how to cryptographically verify a copied file.
And what if an investigator ignores them?
Oh, if an investigator decides to go rogue, uses an unverified piece of software, or fails to document their process according to SWGDE guidelines, a skilled defense attorney will immediately pounce.
Just tear them apart on the stand.
Absolutely. They will argue that the investigator's sloppy process altered the magnetic state of the drive, corrupting the data. And just like that, the pristine computer-generated system log is thrown out of court. The federal rules of evidence demand incredibly high level of rigor.
Which brings us to a fascinating pivot point in our journey today. We now understand the fragile physical nature of the evidence and the legal classifications surrounding it. But as we transition into the actual investigation process, we have to look at who is doing the investigating.
Right, the actors involved.
Because the rules of engagement change drastically depending on whose name is at the top of your paycheck. We're talking about the massive divide between the public sector and the private sector.
This is a fundamental concept for business students to grasp.
Yeah.
When we discuss the public sector in this context, we're referring strictly to law enforcement, local police detectives, the FBI, Homeland Security.
People with badges and government authority.
Exactly. When we discuss the private sector, we are talking about internal investigations within small businesses, massive multinational corporations, or NGOs. These are conducted by internal IT security teams, HR compliance officers, or privately hired forensics firms.
Okay, let's start with the public sector. Law enforcement operates under a very specific, very heavy burden, the United States Constitution, specifically the Fourth Amendment.
The Fourth Amendment is the shield that protects private citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. A police detective cannot just wake up, decide they are suspicious of your online activity, and demand to clone your laptop.
They are legally barred from doing so unless they establish probable cause, right?
Yes, meaning they have to gather concrete facts and circumstances that would lead a reasonable, objective person to believe that a specific crime has occurred and that evidence of that crime is located in a specific place.
And they can't just make that determination themselves, can they?
No, they must take those facts, draft a sworn affidavit, present it to an impartial judge, and obtain a search warrant. It is a purposefully high bar designed over centuries to protect individual privacy from government overreach. But if we turn our attention to the corporate world, the private sector, that constitutional shield operates very differently.
Yeah, this was the part of the material that really caught my attention. If I'm sitting at my desk at a private marketing firm and the company suspects me of violating a policy, maybe stealing proprietary client lists, they don't need to call a judge. They don't need a warrant to search my work computer.
Nope, not at all.
For a lot of people, that feels like a massive invasive loophole. Why doesn't the Fourth Amendment apply in the cubicle?
It comes down to a crucial legal distinction. The Fourth Amendment restricts government action, not private action. Furthermore, it revolves around the concept of a reasonable expectation of privacy. When you are hired by a private company, the landscape changes fundamentally based on ownership and contract law.
Because they own the gear.
Exactly. The company owns the physical laptop sitting on your desk.
Okay.
They own the servers routing your emails. They pay for the network infrastructure.
And as an employee, you sign away certain rights to use that equipment.
Almost universally. On your first day of work, buried in the onboarding paperwork, you sign an acceptable use policy. That contract explicitly states that the equipment is for business purposes, that the company actively monitors network traffic, and that you, as the employee, have absolutely zero expectation of privacy when using their systems.
So from a legal standpoint, the company is not searching your property. They are auditing their own property.
That's it, exactly.
That reframes the entire scenario. It is a highly controlled, privately owned environment. But surely, corporate investigators can't just operate like rogue cowboys. There have to be guardrails, right?
There are significant guardrails, but they are structural and regulatory rather than constitutional. Private sector investigators must comply with state privacy laws, employment laws, and occasionally federal regulations like the Freedom of Information Act if the entity has certain government ties.
Like if they are a government contractor.
Right. But more importantly, within the company itself, there must be a rigidly established chain of command.
Walk us through what that actually looks like during a corporate crisis. Let's say a mid-level manager suspects an employee of selling trade secrets to a competitor. A rogue IT admin can't just take it upon themselves to start imaging the employee's hard drive out of curiosity, right?
Absolutely not. If an IT admin does that, they open the company to massive civil liability for violating internal policies or employment contracts. A private investigation is typically triggered by a formal incident report.
And where does that report go?
That report goes to a designated authority, usually a combination of human resources, the legal department, and the chief information security officer. Only when legal counsel and HR sign off does the forensics team get the green light.
And the physical footprint of that investigation is vastly different from a police raid, I imagine. You don't have SWAT teams kicking down the glass doors of the boardroom to secure a perimeter.
Oh, it's usually entirely invisible. A corporate forensics specialist will likely rely on internal infrastructure. They use configuration management databases, massive internal directories that track exactly which laptop serial number, which operating system, and which IP address is assigned to the suspect.
So they know exactly where to look.
And they can often remotely connect to that laptop after hours, silently acquire a bit-for-bit image of the hard drive over the network, and begin their analysis without the employee ever knowing they are under investigation.
It is incredibly surgical. But what happens when those two worlds collide? What if our corporate investigator is quietly analyzing that remote image to prove the employee is selling trade secrets, but while searching the drive, they stumble across evidence of a severe, undeniable crime, say a folder containing child pornography or detailed plans for an act of terrorism?
That is the moment the entire paradigm shifts. This is known as the compliance exception, or mandatory reporting. The very second a private sector investigator uncovers evidence of this nature, their role fundamentally changes.
In what way?
They must immediately stop their private investigation. They cannot continue browsing the files out of morbid curiosity or to build a stronger internal HR case.
Yeah.
They must immediately notify their legal counsel and hand the evidence over to federal law enforcement.
Wait, why do they have to stop immediately? Why not finish gathering the evidence for the police to help them out?
Because of a legal concept known as the silver platter doctrine and the risk of becoming an agent of the state. If a private citizen finds evidence of a crime and hands it to the police on a silver platter, the police can generally use it, even without a warrant, because the government didn't conduct the search.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, if the private investigator finds the initial evidence, calls the police, and the police say, hey, keep looking and see what else you can find, that private investigator has now effectively become an agent of law enforcement.
Oh, wow. And because they are now acting on behalf of the government, the Fourth Amendment suddenly applies. But they don't have a warrant.
Exactly. Every single file they uncover after that moment constitutes an illegal warrantless search by the government. The evidence becomes deeply tainted and can be entirely thrown out of criminal court. That is why corporate investigators must freeze the scene and step away the moment a serious crime is discovered.
That is a crazy legal tightrope.
Okay, so let's shift our perspective. We are no longer the corporate IT team. We are law enforcement, we suspect a crime, we have probable cause, and we are preparing to execute a raid. We need a search warrant. How specific does a warrant for a computer actually need to be?
This is one of the most persistent headaches for detectives and prosecutors, because police officers and judges are incredibly knowledgeable about the law, but they are not always technical experts.
Right, they might not know the difference between RAM and a hard drive.
Exactly. They might lack the specific granular vocabulary required to describe digital architecture. But the Fourth Amendment demands particularity. A warrant cannot just say, search the suspect's house for anything bad. It must authorize the seizure of specific described evidence. So let's explore the faulty warrant scenario. Let's say a judge signs a warrant, but because they aren't deeply versed in information systems, they use a limiting phrase. The warrant explicitly states that investigators are authorized to seize hardware and data. On its face, to a layperson, that sounds pretty comprehensive. You get the physical machine and you get the files inside it.
It sounds comprehensive until you are sitting in the forensics lab at 2:20 a.m. Imagine you execute the warrant. You seize the servers, you extract the hard drives, you make your forensic copies of the data, you sit down to analyze it, and you realize the target data is locked inside a highly complex, custom-built proprietary database application.
Okay.
The data itself is just encrypted, fragmented gibberish without the specific software executable that reads and structures it.
But you look down at your warrant and it only authorized the seizure of hardware and data. It specifically omitted the word software.
And because of that limiting phrase, you legally cannot seize, copy, or utilize the software needed to make sense of the proprietary data. The evidence collection is effectively ruined. You have legally seized a locked safe, but the judge accidentally forbade you from seizing the key.
That is devastating. A single omitted word from a judge sinks the entire operation. How do investigators mitigate that risk?
They work closely with technical advisors during the drafting of the affidavit to ensure the phrasing is as broad and encompassing as legally permissible. The ideal phrasing usually requests authorization to seize the computer system and all associated parts.
That covers all the bases.
Right. This broader language covers the hardware, the software, the data, the network peripherals, the encryption keys, everything necessary to completely reconstruct the digital environment.
But pushing for broader warrants leads us directly into another incredibly sticky legal paradox. And this is where the intersection of physical law and digital reality really starts to break down. Let's talk about the plain view doctrine.
Oh, yes.
In the physical world of law enforcement, if a police officer has the legal right to be in a location, say, they have a warrant to search a house for a stolen 85-inch television, and while they're in the living room looking for that TV, they see a bag of illegal narcotics sitting out in the open on the coffee table, they can seize those narcotics without needing a separate warrant.
That is the essence of plain view. It prevents officers from having to ignore blatant crimes happening right in front of them. The legal standard for this is called the Horton test.
And what does that test require?
It has three very specific prongs. First, lawful presence. The officer must be legally allowed to be in the room where the discovery is made. Second, lawful access. The officer must be able to physically reach the item without committing a new Fourth Amendment violation. And third, immediate incriminating character recognition.
Yeah.
It must be immediately obvious without further testing or manipulation that the item is contraband or evidence of a crime.
Okay, the Horton test makes perfect sense in a physical house. But how on earth does that translate to a 1 terabyte hard drive? Let's use an analogy. If police are searching a physical house for that stolen 85-inch TV, they are legally forbidden from opening a tiny bedside jewelry box. Why? Because a giant television cannot possibly fit inside a jewelry box.
Right.
If they open it anyway and find drugs, the Horton test fails, and the drugs are thrown out because they had no legal right to look in a space too small for the object of their warrant.
That is the physical limitation of a search.
But in a digital environment, that limitation completely evaporates, doesn't it? A massive database containing 10 million stolen credit card numbers could easily be hidden inside a tiny file folder labeled Grandma's Vacation Photos.
Easily.
So to find the digital TV, investigators literally have to look inside every single digital jewelry box. Doesn't that mean they're inherently looking at everything? How does plain view possibly survive when investigators are forced to do extensive, invasive data sorting just to find what they're legally allowed to look for?
You have just articulated the central tension of modern digital jurisprudence. The physical limitations that protect privacy simply do not exist in the digital realm. Because you're absolutely right to find the specific data authorized by the warrant, a forensic examiner often has to process, categorize, and at least briefly view the metadata of almost every file on the drive.
Which exposes them to everything.
Exactly. This exposes the investigator to massive amounts of what we call innocent information.
Information that is deeply private but entirely unrelated to the crime.
Personal photographs, medical records, mundane emails, tax returns. The vast majority of data on any seized computer is innocent information. If a defense attorney can prove that a forensics examiner used their warrant for financial fraud as an excuse to go on a generalized fishing expedition, like manually opening personal photo albums just to see what was there, the plain view doctrine will absolutely fail. The judge will rule it an unreasonable search, and the evidence will be suppressed.
So how do investigators protect themselves? If they have to look everywhere to find the hidden database, but looking everywhere violates the Fourth Amendment, how do they actually proceed?
They rely on highly structured, automated search methodologies to act as digital blinders.
Blinders, like for a horse?
Basically, yes. Instead of a human investigator manually clicking through folders, they use forensic software to run targeted keyword searches. They search for specific financial terms, account numbers, or known email addresses. They also use hash matching, which we will discuss in depth later, to automatically scan for known contraband without displaying the images to the investigator.
Oh, that's clever.
By using automated tools to filter out the innocent information, they can argue to a judge that their search was narrowly tailored and did not violate the user's general expectation of privacy.
It is a remarkable technological solution to a constitutional problem. Okay, so we have the legal green light, we have a perfectly worded warrant, we understand our plain view limitations. Now, we have to physically go to the location, but the source material from Chapter 5 emphasizes that you don't just grab a laptop, throw it in a backpack, and kick down the door. Preparation is arguably the most critical make-or-break step of the entire investigation.
If you fail to prepare the right equipment, you are quite literally preparing to destroy the evidence you are trying to collect. Step 1 is intelligence gathering. You must identify the nature of the case, the environment you are entering, and crucially, the specific types of operating systems and digital devices you expect to encounter.
Why does knowing the operating system matter so much before you even arrive? Data is just data, isn't it?
Data is universal, but the architecture holding it is highly specific. An Apple ecosystem utilizes different file systems, different hardware connectors, and different encryption protocols than a Windows enterprise environment or a massive Linux-based server farm.
So if you bring the wrong cables,
If you arrive at an Apple-heavy creative agency with a toolkit designed solely for Windows architecture, you are paralyzed. For corporate investigators, this is where those internal configuration management databases are invaluable. They can pull a report and know exactly what model laptop the suspect uses, how much RAM it has, and its total storage capacity.
and knowing the storage capacity dictates how many hard drives you need to physically pack to make copies, which leads us into the gear itself. There is a major distinction in the forensics world between an initial response field kit and an extensive response field kit.
Let's break those down. An initial response field kit is your lightweight, fast-moving option. It contains only the absolute minimum tools required to perform basic, isolated disk acquisitions in the field.
Like what specifically?
We are talking about a specialized forensics laptop loaded with imaging software, a variety of data cables, anti-static bags, and a few hardware write blockers. You deploy this kit when you are dealing with a simple, known scene, like a single employee's laptop in a small office.
But an extensive response field kit is a completely different beast.
An extensive response kit is essentially a portable laboratory. It is packed into heavy-duty Pelican cases. It is designed to process complex, multi-device environments simultaneously. It contains networking tapping gear, standalone drive duplicators, massive arrays of blank storage drives to hold terabytes of copied data, specialized power supplies, and an arsenal of software tools.
You need a van for that.
Pretty much.
Hmm.
You bring the extensive kit to a corporate raid or a scenario where you expect to encounter servers, multiple workstations, and complex network-attached storage.
And beyond the technical gear, investigators have to prepare for physical hazards. We tend to think of digital forensics as this clean, air-conditioned, white-collar profession. But the physical environment can be incredibly dangerous. What happens if the targeted computer is sitting in a clandestine fentanyl processing lab or a biohazard research facility?
That introduces the nightmare of hazmat hazardous materials,
Mm.
chemical, biological, or radiological threats. This fundamentally alters the rules of engagement. If a server is running in a room filled with toxic chemical dust, you cannot simply walk in, breathe the air, and carry the server out.
Right, obviously.
And you absolutely cannot bring a chemically contaminated hard drive back to a clean forensics laboratory because you will cross-contaminate the entire facility.
So what is the protocol? How do you extract digital evidence from a toxic environment?
It requires deep coordination with specialized hazmat technicians. The technicians, wearing full protective suits, will enter the hot zone. They will carefully place the target computer or hard drive into a specialized hazmat evidence bag. But here is the incredible technical challenge. They cannot seal the bag completely. They have to leave the power cable and the data cable sticking out of the opening.
Wait, if the cables are sticking out, how is it a sealed hazmat environment? Doesn't the toxic dust just leak out of the opening?
That is where the specialized training comes in. The hazmat tech must create a perfect airtight seal directly around the exterior casing of the cables, using specialized tapes or epoxies. It functions essentially like a vacuum seal.
Oh, wow.
This traps the physical contaminants inside the bag, completely isolating the dangerous chemistry, but it leaves the electrical conductors, the cables, accessible on the outside.
That is brilliant.
It allows the digital forensics investigator, standing safely in the clean zone, to plug their equipment into those exposed cables. They can power the drive and extract the digital data through the electrical connection without ever physically touching the contaminated hardware or exposing themselves to the hazard.
It sounds like you need to pack for a camping trip, a server farm, and a toxic waste dump all at the same time. With all this complexity and danger in the field, why not just take the computer back to the lab every single time? Wouldn't it be infinitely easier to just unplug it, put it in the trunk, and deal with it in a safe environment?
It would be infinitely easier. Taking the computer to the secure, static-free, highly controlled environment of the lab is always the gold standard. but it is not always legally allowed or physically possible.
Give me a scenario where you are legally barred from taking the physical machine.
Imagine a private sector investigation involving a massive regional bank. The bank suspects an internal threat and authorizes you to investigate a specific server rack. You arrive at the data center, but you quickly realize that powering down and physically removing that server would instantly halt thousands of live credit card transactions happening every minute.
The bank would lose their minds.
The collateral damage to the business would be catastrophic, resulting in millions of dollars in lost revenue and severe reputational damage. The business will not allow you to take their hardware.
Or what if the computer is part of critical infrastructure, like a hospital's life support network? Or it's physically bolted to a desk in a foreign jurisdiction where you only have legal permission to copy data, not seize property.
Exactly. In those scenarios, you have no choice. You must conduct live on-site forensics. And that is why the emphasis on preparation is so heavy. An investigator must constantly evaluate the scene on the fly to determine if they have the tools to acquire the data efficiently without taking the machine. If you show up to a massive corporate data center with only an initial response kit, you have failed before you even cross the threshold.
Okay, let's assume we are perfectly prepared. We arrive at the scene. The physical perimeter has been secured by law enforcement or by corporate security if it's a private matter. The digital investigators step into the room. What happens in those first chaotic minutes of breaching the scene?
The overarching rule, dictated by U.S. Department of Justice Standards for Criminal Matters, is holistic seizure. Investigators must seize entire storage drives. You do not just turn on the suspect's computer, plug in a thumb drive, and drag and drop the My Documents folder.
Why not? That seems faster.
Because that alters the metadata of the files and it completely misses the hidden evidence. You must perform a bit-for-bit forensic image of the entire storage media.
And a bit-for-bit image means you are copying the empty space too. The unallocated space where deleted files might still be lingering before they are overwritten.
Precisely. You capture the active files, the hidden partitions, the system registries, and the deleted fragments. But the seizure goes far beyond just the hard drive. You must seize the entire physical ecosystem, the computer tower, the monitors, the keyboard, the mouse, and every strange custom peripheral plugged into the back.
Taking the tower makes sense. But why the mouse? Does a standard USB mouse really hold digital evidence?
In 99% of cases, no. But in digital forensics, you are defending against the 1%. The principle is that it is impossible to predict what obscure physical component is secretly critical to the system's operation or security. Maybe that seemingly standard keyboard has a tiny hardware-based keylogger soldered into its circuitry, capturing the suspect's passwords before they even reach the operating system.
Or what about the mouse?
Or perhaps that custom USB mouse is actually a specialized dongle required to decrypt a hidden volume on the hard drive.
So if you leave it behind because it looks like a normal mouse, you get back to the lab, try to boot the image, and realize you are permanently locked out of the evidence.
Exactly. You seize the entire ecosystem to preserve the operational reality of the machine. But capturing that reality brings us to the absolute nightmare scenario for any investigator: live computers.
What do you mean?
You walk into the room, the suspect's computer is powered on, the screen is unlocked, and a complex financial database is currently open on the monitor. If you pull the power plug to transport the machine to the lab, you are actively destroying evidence.
Let's break down the mechanics of why that happens. It has to do with RAM, correct?
Yes, RAM is random access memory. It is the computer's short-term working space. When a computer is running, crucial, highly sensitive evidence exists exclusively in the RAM. This could include the raw, unencrypted passwords the user just typed, the decryption keys for their hard drive, active network connections to co-conspirators, or malicious software running stealthily in the background. But RAM is volatile memory.
Meaning it requires a constant flow of electricity to maintain the data.
The circuitry literally requires a continuous electrical charge to hold the ones and zeros in place. The exact millisecond the computer loses power, the electrical charge dissipates, the capacitors drain, and the RAM is wiped completely clean. It is gone forever.
So if you pull the plug, you lose the decryption key that solves the entire case. But you can't exactly ask the suspect to politely carry their running computer to your lab. How do you transport a desktop PC without unplugging it from the wall socket?
This is where we see some truly incredible hardware engineering, specifically tools like the WeebTech Hot Plug Field Kit.
How does that work?
The process of hot plugging is essentially performing open heart surgery on a live electrical system. A desktop computer's power supply takes a 120-volt alternating current from the wall and converts it into specific low-voltage direct current, usually 12 volts, 5 volts, and 3.3 volts to run the motherboard.
So the hot plug kit intercepts that.
Exactly. The investigator carefully opens the computer case while it is still running. They use the hot plug kit to splice directly into the ATX power connector on the motherboard. The kit has its own battery or external power source. It precisely matches the electrical voltage and phase currently running through the system. Once the kit is supplying identical stable power directly to the motherboard, the investigator can safely reach over and pull the main AC plug out of the wall.
The computer's internal power supply dies, but the motherboard never notices because the hot plug kit seamlessly took over the load.
The computer stays running. The RAM remains perfectly intact. The screen stays on. And you can literally carry a running, fully powered desktop PC out the front door, put it in the back of a specially equipped transport vehicle, and drive it to the lab without losing a single electron of volatile evidence.
That is straight out of a spy thriller. But hot plugging works on a single machine. What if you aren't dealing with a standalone desktop? What if the investigation leads you into a corporate data center? The source material mentions the absolute terror of processing server farms equipped with RAID systems.
RAID stands for Redundant Array of Independent Disks. It is the backbone of modern enterprise storage. Large businesses, banks, and cloud providers don't rely on single hard drives because hard drives eventually fail. Instead, they use RAID. They take dozens or hundreds of physical hard drives and link them together through a hardware controller to act as one single, massive logical drive.
And it constantly shuffles data around for speed and safety, right?
Depending on the configuration, like RAID 5, it stripes the data across multiple disks and calculates mathematical parity bits. If one physical drive physically catches fire and dies, the system doesn't lose any data. It uses the parity math on the surviving drives to seamlessly rebuild the missing information. It is brilliant for business continuity, but it is a minefield for forensics.
Because if an investigator walks into a room with 50 blinking servers and tries to plug in a standard forensics imaging tool, what happens?
It can trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. Standard forensic tools are designed to interact directly with the physical sectors of a hard drive. But in a RAID environment, the hardware controller intercepts everything. If an investigator tries to force a command to read the unallocated space on a live RAID array without intensely testing the interaction first, the RAID controller might misinterpret that strange forensic command as a disk error.
And how does a RAID controller respond to an error?
It panics. It immediately assumes the drive has failed and initiates an automated rebuild sequence to protect the array. It will start aggressively overwriting terabytes of data across dozens of disks to restore parity. In a matter of seconds, an overconfident investigator could instantly corrupt a multi-million-dollar business system and permanently obliterate the very evidence they were sent to collect.
Career over, instantly.
Which is precisely why Chapter 5 stresses the critical necessity of a technical advisor.
Right. The technical advisor isn't necessarily the lead detective or the head of HR. They are the highly specialized, highly paid expert called in to navigate these specific, high-end architectures. If you encounter a massive Oracle database running on a complex Linux RAID array, you don't guess how to extract the data. You step back and you call the Oracle whisperer.
The technical advisor understands the proprietary architecture. They direct the investigators, detailing the exact command line arguments needed, ensuring the forensic software won't trigger a destructive rebuild, and guaranteeing that the data extraction is technically sound and legally defensible.
And while all this high-tech, high-stakes data extraction is happening while technicians are hot-plugging motherboards and navigating RAID controllers, there is someone standing by the door doing something incredibly low-tech, but arguably just as important.
Keeping a journal. The scene journal is the absolute backbone of the courtroom narrative. It must be an obsessively detailed, time-stamped record of every single human interaction and every significant technical task performed at the scene. It records exactly who entered the room at 10:04 a.m. It records exactly what time the power was spliced. It records who authorized the disconnection of the server.
Why is that timeline so critical?
Because the defense attorney is going to attack the chaos of the scene. If you cannot perfectly recreate the sequence of events, if you can't prove exactly who had access to the server room, and when the defense will argue that an unauthorized person slipped in and tampered with the machine. Meticulous access control and a flawless scene journal insulate the technical evidence from human doubt.
Okay, we have successfully breached the scene, we have navigated the RAID arrays, we've extracted the drives, and our journal is perfect. Now we transition to the transport phase. We have to move this digital gold mine back to the highly controlled environment of the forensics lab without destroying it and without breaking the chain of custody.
And this requires a deep respect for the extreme fragility of digital evidence. We just spent a lot of time discussing how the law treats data as physical evidence. But physically, a hard drive or a microchip is vastly more delicate than a physical weapon. A bloody knife doesn't lose its fingerprints if the room gets a little too warm, but an electrical component can be corrupted or completely destroyed by environmental factors we barely even register.
We are talking about things like extreme temperatures in the trunk of a car or the magnetic fields generated by everyday electronics.
Exactly. Or the silent killer of computer hardware, electrostatic discharge, or ESD.
The shock you get when you drag your socks across a carpet and touch a doorknob.
Yes. That tiny spark that slightly stings your finger can carry thousands of volts of static electricity. To a human, it's a nuisance. To the microscopic, nanometer-scale transistors inside a solid-state drive or a RAM chip, a static shock is the equivalent of a lightning strike. It instantly vaporizes the silicon pathways. If an investigator carelessly handles a bare circuit board after walking across a carpeted office, they can instantly wipe the drive.
So how do you protect against the invisible threat of static electricity during transport?
Transport protocols require the use of commercially manufactured anti-static bags. These aren't just plastic Ziplocs. They are specialized containers, often coated with a slightly conductive metallic layer. They act as a Faraday cage. If static electricity strikes the outside of the bag, the metallic coating safely disperses the charge around the exterior surface, protecting the fragile components nestled inside from the electrical spike.
Beyond the physical protection, there is the security aspect. If I'm the investigator and I toss the suspect's bagged hard drive onto the passenger seat of my car, can I stop at a diner for lunch on the way back to the lab?
Absolutely not. The evidence must remain under constant verifiable surveillance by the investigator or an assigned evidence custodian. The moment you leave that drive unattended in a parked car, you have broken the chain of custody. You have created a window of opportunity where tampering could theoretically occur, and the defense will exploit that window relentlessly.
Never let it out of your sight. Okay, we arrive safely at the lab, the humming, static-free, secure environment. What is the very first thing we do with the suspect's drive?
We lock it away. We adhere to the absolute golden rule of digital forensics: never work with the original media.
Never. Not even to just take a quick peek to see if the files are there?
Never. The moment the original drive arrives, it is logged, and it goes directly into a secure evidence cabinet. We only ever work from exact, verified digital copies. To do otherwise is professional malpractice. The industry standard is a rigid four-step process to create the image files we actually analyze.
Walk us through those 4 steps. How do we copy a drive without accidentally altering it in the process?
Step 1, we utilize a hardware write blocker. This is a physical device that sits between the investigator's computer and the suspect's drive. When the investigator's operating system tries to interact with the drive, it naturally sends microscopic write commands updating last read times, indexing files.
And the write blocker stops that.
Yes. The firmware inside the write blocker physically intercepts those hexadecimal write commands. It drops the command before it ever reaches the suspect drive and returns a fake success signal to the investigator's OS so it doesn't crash. It guarantees that not a single electron of data is written to the evidence.
That is a brilliant piece of engineering. So the evidence is protected from the investigator's own computer. What's step 2?
Step 2 is creating a bitstream image. Using forensic software, we copy every single bit, every 1 and 0, including the empty space from the suspect drive into a massive image file on our lab servers. Step 3 is verifying that image to prove it is an exact duplicate, which involves hashing, a critical concept we will break down shortly.
And the final step?
Step 4 is analysis. We lock the original drive back in the vault, and we perform all of our searches, keyword scans, and data recovery exclusively on the verified image file.
That ensures that if a defense attorney questions our methods, another independent investigator can take the pristine original drive, run the exact same 4 steps, and get the exact same results. It makes the science reproducible.
Reproducibility is the bedrock of scientific evidence. But let's look down the road. Once the investigation is over, or if a case drags through the appellate courts for a decade, you have to store this massive amount of data. The textbook discusses the complexities of archiving, noting that investigators must constantly balance cost, durability, and access time.
Right, because you can't just keep buying $1,000 high-capacity hard drives to sit on a shelf gathering dust for 20 years. It would bankrupt the department.
Exactly. So laboratories rely on different archiving media. Optical media, like CDs and DVDs, are cheap, but they suffer from disk rot. The reflective chemical layers degrade over time, leading to data loss. Magnetic tapes are fantastic for storing massive petabytes of data, and they are very cheap per gigabyte, but they are incredibly slow to access because they are linear. You have to fast-forward the physical tape to find a file.
The source material also mentioned M disks. What are those?
M disks are fascinating. They look like DVDs, but instead of using a degradable organic dye to store data, a high-powered laser physically engraves the data bits into a stone-like glassy carbon layer. Because it is a physical etching rather than a chemical change, manufacturers claim they can last for hundreds of years without degrading. The choice of archiving media ultimately depends on the size of the data set, the lab's budget, and the specific legal retention requirements of the jurisdiction.
And tracking all of this, who sees the drive, who applied the right blocker, who moved it to the M-Disk archive, relies entirely on a single piece of paper, the evidence custody form.
The evidence custody form is arguably the most important document in the entire laboratory. It is a living, continuous record that tracks the unbroken chain of custody. Every single time that original evidence leaves the secure locker, the investigator taking it must sign it out with a specific date and time. When they finish their imaging process, they sign it back in.
Creating a perfect timeline.
It creates a flawless, documented timeline of exactly who had physical access to the evidence from the moment it was seized in the field to the moment it is presented to a jury.
And what happens if someone forgets to sign the log? Let's say an investigator pulls the drive at 2:00 p.m., does the copy, puts it back at 4:00 p.m., but forgets to sign the form until the next morning.
That administrative error can destroy the entire case. If the chain of custody is broken, if there is an undocumented gap where the evidence's location or handler is unaccounted for, the defense attorney will relentlessly attack that gap. They will argue that during those undocumented hours, the drive was vulnerable to tampering, alteration, or contamination. And judges take this incredibly seriously. A brilliant, undeniable technical analysis means absolutely nothing if you cannot legally prove the evidence is authentic and untampered.
Which brings us to the climax of the entire forensics process, proving the integrity of the data. We are standing in the courtroom, the jury's watching. We are looking at a printed copy of a highly incriminating financial spreadsheet. We testify that we extracted this spreadsheet from a digital image file, which was copied from the suspect's hard drive in our lab.
Setting the stage for the defense.
Exactly. The defense attorney stands up, points at the printout, and asks the jury, how do we know the investigator didn't accidentally alter the numbers in this spreadsheet when they copied it? Or worse, how do we know this rogue investigator didn't intentionally plant this file on the copy to frame my client?
It is the ultimate challenge of digital forensics. You are dealing with invisible electrons. How do you prove they haven't moved? And the answer to the defense attorney is not, trust me, I'm an ethical professional.
I don't think a judge would buy that.
They wouldn't. The answer relies on absolute, undeniable mathematics. The problem of data integrity is solved by generating a digital hash.
Hashing. This is a term that gets thrown around constantly in cybersecurity, cryptography, and blockchain discussions. But for the business students listening who might not have a deep computer science background, what is a hashing algorithm in plain English? How does it actually work?
To understand hashing, we need to abandon analogies about physical copying and think about complex mathematical puzzles. Think of a hashing algorithm like an incredibly complex, multidimensional game of Sudoku, where the rules of the puzzle are dictated entirely by the binary data of the file you are examining.
Okay, I'm following.
You take a file, it could be a one-page Word document, a high-resolution photograph, or an entire 10-terabyte hard drive image. You feed the raw binary data, the millions of ones and zeros, into the mathematical algorithm. The algorithm processes all of that data and outputs a fixed-length string of letters and numbers. That string is the hash value.
So it's essentially a highly complex, mathematically generated digital fingerprint for that specific file.
Yes. But what makes it a fingerprint is a property called the avalanche effect. The math is designed so that the output is entirely deterministic yet chaotic. If you have a massive financial database and you generate a hash value, you get a specific string.
Right.
But if you open that database and you change a single microscopic comma into a period altering just a few bits out of billions, and you run the file through the algorithm again.
The puzzle resolves entirely differently.
Exactly. The avalanche effect means that changing a single bit of input changes roughly 50% of the output bits. The new hash value will not look even remotely similar to the first one. It won't be off by one number. It will be a completely unrecognizable string.
And this is how we mathematically prove data integrity in court.
Precisely. When we execute the search warrant and seize the original drive, before we do anything else, we use a hardware tool to calculate the hash value of the entire original drive. We write that string of letters and numbers down, then we go through our four-step process, utilizing the right blocker to create our bitstream copy.
And then you hash the copy.
Once the copy is finished, we run the algorithm on the copy. If the hash value of the copy matches the hash value of the original perfectly, character for character, we have mathematical certainty proven beyond any reasonable doubt that our copy is an exact, flawless bit-for-bit duplicate. The data has not changed by a single microscopic pixel.
That completely neutralizes the defense attorney's argument. You can definitively prove you didn't plant a file because if you had added even a 1 kilobyte text file to a 10 terabyte drive, the final hash value would have wildly fractured.
It removes human trust from the equation and replaces it with cryptographic proof. And the efficiency is staggering. If you tried to prove a 10 terabyte copy was identical to the original by having a computer compare them byte by byte, it would take days of processing power. But computing the hash of the copy and comparing it to the short 32-character hash string of the original takes a fraction of the time. It is the only feasible way to verify massive datasets.
But the textbook mentions that not all hashes are created equal. There are non-keyed hash sets and keyed hash sets. What is the functional difference between the two?
A non-keyed hash set is the standard tool for forensics. It is a unique number generated by a publicly known software algorithm, like MD5 or SHA-1. Anyone in the world who runs that exact file through the MD5 algorithm will get the exact same result. It is brilliant for verifying static evidence in a lab. But a keyed hash set, often referred to as an HMAC, adds a critical layer of active security.
How so?
The value is created using the standard mathematical algorithm, but it heavily incorporates a secret encryption key into the math itself.
Why would an investigator need to inject a secret key into the fingerprint?
Imagine you are investigating a highly sophisticated corporate espionage ring, and you need to transmit the hash values of your evidence across an unsecured network to a partner agency. Or perhaps you suspect an insider threat, someone with deep forensics knowledge who might try to alter the copied evidence and then maliciously generate a new fake hash value to cover their tracks, making the altered copy look legitimate.
If they know you use standard MD5, they can just recalculate the MD5 after they plant the evidence.
Exactly. But with a keyed hash, the math requires the secret key to resolve. Even if the malicious actor has the file and they know you use the SHA-256 algorithm, they cannot generate the correct verifiable hash value to prove the file is authentic without possessing your secret key. It physically prevents malicious alteration by someone trying to game the forensics process.
That is a brilliant countermeasure. Okay, as we near the end of our deep dive, I want to bring this full circle, specifically for the students at the Dr. Sampak College of Business who are eyeing careers in corporate management or IT infrastructure. We started this discussion with the chaotic physical crime scene, kicking down doors, navigating hazmat environments, hot-plugging servers. But how do modern companies investigate employee compliance, policy violations, and internal threats without turning their corporate headquarters into a literal crime scene?
They do it silently, proactively, and remotely. The future of corporate investigations is shifting heavily away from physical seizure and moving toward continuous, covert network surveillance. Organizations are under immense pressure to ensure employees follow acceptable use policies, to protect intellectual property from competitors, and to comply with strict government data regulations.
And you can't just raid every cubicle.
No, physically seizing an executive's laptop disrupts business, damages morale, and alerts the suspect. So they deploy remote forensics tools directly into the network architecture.
What does that actually look like in practice? What kind of tools are operating behind the scenes while an employee is just trying to answer emails?
Modern enterprise networks are heavily instrumented. Security teams might deploy endpoint detection software that acts like an advanced keylogger, tracking if an employee is typing credentials into unauthorized personal cloud storage accounts. More critically, they rely on network sniffers.
Network sniffers.
These are hardware or software sensors that continuously monitor and inspect data packets as they transit the internal network in real time. They are looking for anomalies, detecting if a massive encrypted CAD file containing unreleased product designs is suddenly being routed to a strange external IP address in a foreign country.
So earlier we used the analogy of hashing as a digital fingerprint for a static file. That is very similar to how police use AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, to rapidly scan a database and match real-world prints found at a physical crime scene. But on the corporate side, they are acting much more proactively. They are using these digital network sniffers like invisible automated security guards, scanning the perimeter and catching internal policy breaches in real time as the data moves.
That is the perfect way to contextualize it. AFIS is inherently retroactive. It looks backward to solve a crime that has already occurred.
Yeah.
But with network sniffers and advanced remote access capabilities built into modern IT infrastructure, corporate investigators are watching the perimeter live.
So they don't even need to leave their desks.
If a sniffer flags anomalous behavior, the IT forensics team doesn't need to walk down to the employee's cubicle. They can quietly initiate a remote session, capture a forensic image of the employee's hard drive over the network while the employee is away at lunch, and conduct a full mathematically verified investigation, all while minimizing direct contact. It allows the organization to maintain rigorous security seamlessly behind the scenes without disrupting the flow of business.
It is an incredibly powerful capability, and it highlights exactly why understanding the legal and technical boundaries of these tools is so vital for future business leaders. We have covered an extraordinary amount of ground today. Let's recap the incredible journey of a piece of digital evidence.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. It begins by being legally classified by the courts as a tangible physical object, subject to the complex rules of the hearsay divide. It has to survive the constitutional gauntlet of the Fourth Amendment, specific warrants, and the perilous, highly contested plain view doctrine.
Not to mention the physical dangers.
Right. It avoids physical destruction from toxic hazmat environments, raid rebuilds, or static electricity because investigators utilize write blockers and meticulous preparation. It gets flawlessly copied in the lab. And finally, its absolute authenticity is mathematically proven to a jury via complex hashing algorithms. It is an exhausting, technically demanding, and utterly fascinating process.
It is a process that operates on a razor's edge. It requires the technical acumen of a computer scientist and the procedural paranoia of a legal scholar, because in digital forensics, there is absolutely no room for error. One misconfigured write blocker, one poorly phrased warrant, one missing signature on a chain of custody form, and the evidence vanishes like smoke in a courtroom.
And that leads me to a final, provocative thought to leave you with. Think about the rapid trajectory of the technology we've discussed. Today, Chapter 5 teaches us how to send specialized teams into the field to physically seize spinning hard drives, carefully pack them in metallic antistatic bags, and lock them in steel evidence cabinets.
The physical reality of it all.
But as our personal lives and massive corporate infrastructures migrate entirely into the cloud as local, physical hard drives become obsolete relics of the past. Will the concept of the physical crime scene eventually disappear entirely? Will the digital forensics investigators of tomorrow ever actually need to pack a hazmat suit, or hot plug a power supply, or secure a physical perimeter?
That's a huge question.
Or will all crime scenes and all high-stakes investigations exist purely in the invisible ether of remote international data centers, fought entirely through keyboards, network sniffers, and complex international court subpoenas?
That is the absolute frontier of the discipline. And the legal frameworks we rely on today are already straining to keep up with that borderless reality.
Definitely something to mull over the next time you log in to your Tarleton State student portal or your corporate network. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration of processing crime and incident scenes gave you some serious aha moments and practical, actionable insights for your own careers in business and technology. Remember, be sure to check the description for access to additional resources you may find of value. Next week, we are moving into Chapter 6, working with Microsoft File Systems and the Windows Registry, where we get even more granular with how data hides within the OS.
It's going to be a good one.
It really is. And please review our channel for other podcasts, playlists, videos, and classes to help you educate yourself and continuously learn. That's a wrap on this episode of Digital Forensics. Until next time, analyze the copy, preserve the original.